Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. How are you today? I am William from the Applied Virtue channel, and tonight I have a very special guest. Meet Not Our Guy.
Hey everybody, I'm at not our guy with underscores on Twitter. Hitler hated Christ is the name of the account, which is different from the actual at of the account. I've been trying to move away from the Hitler hated Christ branding to the not our guy branding, just because it's a little bit less cringe just to say in public, especially.
Fair
Telling
enough.
people I run a Hitler Twitter account, Um, yeah, that could be uncomfortable depending upon the social situation, weird, but anyway, yeah, so I run that Twitter account, and I think William and I had talked or spoken to each other. We were just talking about this backstage, but for or maybe over a year or two ago. It's been a while.
Yes, it has been since, and it was on my other channel too. And for those of you who are not in the know, I had a different Applied Virtue channel, but technical difficulties robbed me of that channel because it
Oh,
kept on. It kept on going. I lost sometime, I believe, last December, or sorry, it was the not last December, but December 2023.
right.
I lost my old laptop and my old iPhone at the same time. And
Oh,
so I had to get new ones, new devices. And when I got these new devices, I lost my Google account. And
ah,
and for the better part of a year, I was stuck in a loop where it would tell me, "Hey, wait a month." I send it to my backup Proton account, Proton Mail account. Hey, wait a month. Boom. I wait a month. It says, yeah, nope, it's too late. Wait another month. And I did. This happened for over the course of a year until I said, you know what? I give up. You
the
win,
the point
Google.
is
You
to
get the account.
demoralize you. They wanted you to
It's
leave, so they just did that to you. Yeah,
no. I'm. This is uh, little do they know that this is my hobby. I do this for fun. Anyway,
exactly.
um,
Yes, they have no power
and
over us if it's just recreation. I understand.
so uh, but for anybody here who could be who is watching or could be watching in the future, um, what inspired you to start this not our guy HHC business, and what's the central message you aim to communicate?
Yeah, so good question. So I started it, I guess it's been like almost 2, 3 years now, somewhere in there. Maybe like 2022, 2023. And I've known a lot of people in dissident right spaces, both in person and online for a pretty long time. I mean, like coming up on about 10 years now, maybe a little bit more. And one thing that I kept noticing was a lot of these guys drifting into these more esoteric, authoritarian, totalitarian, whatever ideologies on the right and beliefs um, were believers, or they were professing Christians. And I felt like there was an increasing disconnect, especially in their view of history in the 20th century around Nazism and their faith. And I initially read a book by Dr. Richard Ricart, which was the inspiration for me to start the Twitter account, where I was basically taking information from that book, finding the original sources and languages as best I could online and through different avenues, and then posting about them on Twitter, which it was Twitter at the time, right? So that's I still call it Twitter. I refuse to call it X, which I think is pretty common, and I'm glad about that. But anyway, and the account sort of, for a while made, at the beginning, I remember it kind of got a lot of traction, and then it sort of ebbed and flowed. And interestingly enough, just over the last 2 or 3 years, this topic has become more and more central. And it seems like every few months, somebody on the right says something about Nazism or whatever, and I get flooded with mentions, right? And so, hey, what is this person saying about this? If this person is a Christian, like you need to set him straight or whatever. And it's sort of turned into this revolving door of handling these sort of controversies that have popped up. And it's not really what I set out to do with the account. But I think I've been effective, especially in like source retrieval, in trying to show ultimately that the beliefs of Nazi Germany and specifically Hitler, and I don't think that those are necessarily separable, aren't compatible with a biblical worldview. I know people don't like the word worldview, but I still use it because I think it's a great word. But anyway, so putting that stuff out there, I got a lot of negative attention, and I really met a lot of people all over the spectrum. And I know we talked about this a little bit last time, but I really do have a heart for people who I think are caught up in a lot of these ideological beliefs, and I do think it hampers their faith. I think it drives them to sort of bitterness and resentfulness, which is harmful to their soul. And I've seen that in real life as well as online in different people that have really sort of personified and come into these ideologies where it's taken over their life and totally directed their thinking.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's quite. Yeah, a lot of people. Well, if you've been on the radical right-wing space for as long as I or not our guy have, you will know. You will start seeing a lot of radical right thought that runs contrary to Christianity, and self-consciously so. They might say, in modern parlance, they might say that Christianity was the original wokeness, or Christianity was the original leftism, and essentially they take the same view as the average leftoid, saying that Christianity is essentially communism, and then they just go the opposite direction. Instead of saying, "Oh, if you're a Christian, you should be a communist," they go, "Well, if you're not a communist, then you can't be a Christian either."
Yeah, and that would be I guess sort of the perspective from the like left-wing end of this, right? Because there are a lot of people, ironically enough, a lot of them Jewish, or funnily enough, that are motivated to correlate closely Nazism and Hitler with Christianity. And that is one thing that is funny, is that I will get sent the same sources and information from people who are rabid leftists who hate Christianity as I do from rabid right-wingers who claim to love Christianity about this topic, depending upon sort of what axe they have to grind politically. And I really wanted to cut through a lot of that when I made the account. And I feel like I've been relatively successful in doing that. I'm always looking for people who do disagree with me on that topic to do some sort of formalized debate. I am looking to talk to Christians about that specifically, and primarily for a variety of different reasons. But I know that, Will, I'm sure you've seen people kind of on both ends of the spectrum that have taken issue with the things I've said on this account about Hitler and his beliefs in relation to Christianity.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people who are exposed to these radical right-wing ideas, they want to maintain the faith of their fathers, but they don't have the they feel like they can't reconcile their faith to these new right-wing ideas that seem to make so much sense to them. And so they try to create a hybrid of the two, which is what you find within certain apologetic spheres. I mean, Corey Mahler is a perfect example of this, I think. He's kind of taking for a while I didn't really know much about Corey Mahler, other than he was a Lutheran who seemed to be interested in ideas like kinism. But then he started posting some very odd things, evil things, I would say. Like, for example, in a recent tweet, he defended Joseph Goebbels committing murder-suicide on his own family, and saying that it was his paternal duty as a father.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
And it is a kind of, and our mutual friend Dave, the distributist, he said that there's something spiritually sick about people who think that that's a good thing. Those kinds of people And I remember at that point, it just kind of, my opinion of Corey Mahler soured quite a bit after that. You don't.
It's solidified. Yeah, I gotcha. I see what you mean. Yeah, and the interesting thing about him is that he's really started with the premise of a National Socialist, Nazi worldview, and built his theology on top of that. And I think the apex of this, and we were talking about this earlier in backstage before the stream, was his debate with James White, which happened relatively recently. I guess it's been like a month or something, or within a month maybe. And the premise of which was, can the Holy Spirit sanctify a black person as much as a white person? I think that's actually verbatim what it was. Am I right, Will?
Well, I mean, yes, but he Corey Mahler put on several dozen qualifications to that before the debate even began.
Right.
And I'm surprised that James White even took the debate, considering that apparently he agreed to all of those qualifications.
Yeah, James White had mentioned on I think several streams, and I think he even told this to me personally, that that he did not expect Corey to actually accept that premise to the debate, and so when Corey did, he was pretty surprised. And you're right about the qualifications. I will say though that the qualifications were rather telling, and maybe this is more me speaking from a more Calvinistic perspective on sovereignty and things like this. That Corey really dug his heels in on trying to make claims about God not being capable of doing certain things, right? And went so far to make the sort of argument used by Reddit atheists a lot about God not being capable of, or if God is capable of making a stone so heavy he can't lift it, right? The Euthyphro dilemma.
Well, I don't think, no, that's not the Euthyphro dilemma.
Oh, is it not? Which one is that? I may be getting mixed up.
The stone God being the stone being so heavy, that's just like a Reddit tier argument. It's not really serious. The Euthyphro dilemma is something along the lines of if God is so the idea is that the dilemma for those of you who don't know, the dilemma appears in Plato's Euthyphro. Euthyphro proposes that the pious is the same thing as that which is loved by the gods. But Socrates finds a problem with this proposal. The gods may disagree among themselves. Euthyphro then revises his definition so that piety is only that which is loved by all the gods unanimously, at which point the dilemma surfaces. Socrates asks whether the gods love the pious because it is pious, or whether the pious is pious only because it is loved by the gods.
Okay. Yeah.
So the
I've been reading different things about the natural law stuff. I think we plan to talk about, and that's why it's in my brain right now.
But the point of that Mahler was making is that God can't do certain things given his nature. The problem is that he's talking about contingent circumstances. And it's not clear how God could be limited by contingent circumstances in the natural world that he himself sets up. He's the author.
Right.
He is the author of nature. And so if he wants to change the nature of things, he can do so. And furthermore, it wouldn't, even if we grant that God can't change the nature of black people, or whatever that means, that's not really the debate. The debate is whether God can sanctify Africans as they exist right now. And the answer is very obviously yes, because God's grace builds on top of nature. It is not limited by nature.
Right, and I think we would both agree on that, and this maybe kind of will circle back into the natural law stuff we may talk about a little bit here later. But
Mhm.
one thing that was interesting to me about that, in that, and then the fact that his mind sort of even went that direction with the argument, and I know he's trying to, do the Olympic level mental gymnastics as best he can for the premise of the debate, which he accepted, and I'm sure he wouldn't have preferred, right? But I will say that it was interesting that his mindset was such that he considered the idea of God being capable of sanctifying a black person on par with questions of God's ability to do things that are contrary to what seems to us to be logic itself.
Well, I mean,
Right?
it's kind of
The perception
that
that
would
just
not.
seems to be like wildly out of the universe in terms of proportions, right? It's just like these are
I mean,
so different things, right?
I mean, yeah. I mean, granted, I would let me. He puts so many different qualifications on it that he puts a lot of qualifications. It's not just can God sanctify a black person. It's can God sanctify the average black person as much as he can the average white person, if given current circumstances.
Right.
Or
Yeah, he
something
did
like
have a
that.
little thing, I think, in like even his opening where he
It's
said
so it
that.
was
Yeah, he tried to sort of
he was
redefine it
so
as that.
he was so long-winded. His introduction was just him talking about the nature of a debate. Like,
Right.
but dude, you we're not here to receive a lecture on what debating is.
Well, I guess my
I'm not.
question to you, which is interesting to me, would be who in the Catholic space would be Corey Mahler? Do you guys have like some really hardcore, um,
I'm.
like kinist
I
integralist
don't
or
doubt.
something that exists? It's
I
like that,
don't. I
or
don't. I don't doubt that they exist. I mean, there are plenty of people online who are who proclaim themselves to be Catholic and yet hold very racialist views. But I've never seen a Catholic make such a wild claim. But I doubt that you've ever seen a Reformed person make such a wild claim about natural God's abilities.
yeah, not
Um,
outside like weird Twitter or something with anonymous accounts. I just wonder
oh,
because there are a lot of theories that
wait.
Corey may end up
All right,
swimming the Tiber.
we've got one. We've got one.
Oh,
Nick Fuentes. Duh.
oh, yeah. I don't know.
He's
I've
like
heard different things on that.
well, I mean, I don't think Nick would be it would is see the thing about Nick Fuentes is that he's not really in the apologetic space. I mean, he's dipped his toes in here and
Right.
there, but like he's not exactly a mainstream Thomist. I mean, for one thing, I remember in one debate he defended divine command theory, so
Based.
it was not.
Based.
Oh yeah, yeah. So he's not exactly with it. He kind of marches to the beat of his own drum, which I think you have to if you are in the sphere of trying to reconcile
Right.
Catholicism with Catholicism or Christianity in general with some of these radical ideas. But the problem is the thing with Nick again, he's not an apologist like Mahler is. He doesn't really. I don't really take him very seriously in terms of, and I don't in terms of like what his ideas are, and I haven't for years. I mean, last time I remember him saying that he supported Kamala Harris during the 2024 election, and I'm like, okay, well,
Yeah. 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 I think he's kind of an interesting case because I've had people tell me that he is primarily only like radical online for shock value. And I think that there's some part of that that's probably true. I will tell you, I have dealt with a lot of groypers or people that would identify as groypers who are tradcaths or tradcath identifying that are very pro Hitler, right? And some of that less
well,
actually now than even a couple of years ago. So I wonder if even if with Kanye and all this other stuff, it's sort of drifted into the ironic more, which is probably good. I mean, I don't want these young guys like actually out here not understanding what's a meme, right?
Yeah, exactly. And you know what? I think that if I going back to Mahler, perhaps there's some of this attempt to merge the far right ethno-nationalism with reformed theology. What do you think is fundamentally incompatible between these ideologies and Orthodox Christianity? Because we've been talking a bit about a bit around it, but I think it might be helpful to lay that out for the audience.
I would say that colloquially, like as people would would use the term today in Protestant circles, that Mahler's not reformed, because I'm pretty sure he doesn't hold to all five tulip.
I think he's Lutheran. The reason why I was so confused by his statements is that he sounded a lot like a biological version of reprobation, where God is damning an entire race, and that sounded like Calvinism, except warped and twisted into something horrible.
Yeah, you're right. There is something like that. There's sort of a joke in some of the chats and stuff I'm in about dark Calvinism, and it's this idea that God is fully sovereign, and the mechanism that He's used to call out His elect is genetics or something. And I mean, as far as I can tell, that's just a non-existent thing in terms of Reformed tradition. I would even say that the view of total depravity and the Reformed interpretation of us becoming new creations through regeneration is something that's totally incompatible with Mahler's view on race and residual behavior from things like genetics and stuff like this. And I think James White sort of mentioned that in the debate a little bit, but I don't think he pressed it super hard because he was dancing around questions about, what was it that what platypus ate or something, right?
Oh, can God make a man pregnant?
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Mahler completely wasted his debate time. I mean, he has the most. If I were to be debating something I knew was highly controversial, what I would do is try to make the best possible argument in the shortest amount of time. I would not want to go on and on and on and belabor the point. It's fine to ask those kinds of leading questions, but there's a point where it stops being helpful and starts becoming a kind of running gag.
Yeah, and I will say, while watching the debate, I was pretty happy because it did seem like a lot of people who were at odds on other topics, even politically, were coming together in even the comments and chat to sort of laugh at how absurd it was. So I think some of that is good. I think that people need to remain lighthearted on these topics, because one of the things that you can do is you can take so much of it too seriously and you get real melodramatic about it. And in reality, these sort of quote unquote movements online are not having that large an effect in the real world. And I think for most people that aren't just sort of like weirdly interested in it or called to it by the Holy Spirit, I don't think worrying about it is very beneficial, right? You may think I'm wrong, but I don't see in my local church people showing up that are like Mahlerites, right? I've heard from some pastors in different circles that have said that they've had one or two young men, kind of drift in, say some weird stuff and leave, but I haven't heard anything about entire congregations being affected in any substantive sense by this stuff.
So you don't see this as part of a larger trend, like radical ethno-nationalist or neo-reactionary ideas entering Christian apologetics?
I think online it is a trend, but I really do feel like online versus these people in real life, there's a sharp distinction there, because I question pretty sincerely how many of the guys in these circles are attending church regularly, especially with some of the things that I've seen said in various different spheres in these groups about how they would never attend churches that do, and then they give a giant list, right? And there may be one church in like a 300-mile radius that would conform to that kind of list, right? So based on just something like that, I'm skeptical that these guys are in bodies consistently and are under some kind of authority within their local church. I just don't see that.
Yeah, it seems to me like this is something that will take people away from the faith. And in my opinion, it comes down to, I think it comes down to Christian leaders not adequately stepping up to meet some of the problems in the modern world, and then these people online, these online voices. It's not just like ethno-nationalist voices. It's also you also see this in the manosphere with Andrew Tate and that crowd. They come at you, and they're willing to speak about the problems in the modern world that maybe your pastor isn't or your parents or whoever is the authority in your life isn't speaking to. Right. And that causes them to fall away from the faith, because I'm going to be honest, a lot of Christian leaders, they have almost a disdain for young men. And by young men, I mean people younger than myself, young millennials, Zoomers, and people that come after. I think a lot of the older folk, the Gen X and the Boomer generations, they have this kind of disdain towards that generation for whatever reason, and it drives them away. And I think this is why, even if you might disagree with him, I think Dave the Distributist is really people like him who care a lot about orthodoxy, but also care about these kinds of issues. I think more people like him are necessary to prevent people from falling away from the faith, or worse, coming into contact with someone like Mahler, who maybe has the same motivation as Dave, but he's compromised on his orthodoxy.
Right. I can kind of see where you're coming from, and I think maybe probably 4 or 5 years ago I would have agreed with you a little bit more wholeheartedly. It's not so much that I feel like that's not happening in the church as it is I don't see the solutions that are being held up as being beneficial for young guys. And maybe the best way I can kind of explain this is, do you know what seeker sensitivity is, or are you familiar with that concept? So you have a term that maps onto that.
I was never familiar with that term until you brought it up on Twitter, and we
okay
discussed it. Yeah, See, the thing is, seeker sensitivity is not something that is talked about within Catholic circles, as far as I can tell. I've never heard of it.
Yeah, and it may be that it just doesn't have a label, because weirdly enough, I've heard guys that are traditional Catholics, even in real life, sort of complain about it without using the term seeker sensitivity. And usually it has something to do more with it's traditional Latin Mass versus Novus Ordo, right? That's the distinctive difference between your Latin versus your English Mass, right?
Well, I mean, they're both within the Latin Rite. There is an issue going on where the hierarchy, the discipline of the hierarchy is they have this idea that the Latin Rite is too elitist. The traditional Latin Mass is too elitist, and that's a hotbed for radical right-wing dissidents, and so they try to crack down on it. And I think there was this one bishop in Charlotte where he was making arguments along the lines of, well, we can't have prayers in Latin because the Spanish-speaking immigrants wouldn't be able to understand it.
Right. Okay. So then that's a great example because, and the stuff that I heard guys complain about from the traditional, from the traditional perspective would kind of go into that same vein, which secret sensitivity would just be sort of conforming your church and your liturgy and your worship and basic life in the body of Christ such that anyone can come and walk in and not feel particularly alienated, right? And this was a discussion in Protestant circles. I mean, I guess it's been for like several decades now. I don't exactly know when it would have begun, but coming out of sort of a highly evangelistic perspective, which I hold, and I hold dearly on some level. But the idea is that we need to conform our churches so that if somebody comes in from some specific area of life or lifestyle or background, that they don't feel alienated and that they're more likely to be comfortable and participate and all that.
Sorry for interrupting. I just realized the key word in Catholic circles is the word pastoral.
Okay, pastoral. Well then that sounds like it's y'all's. So how would you use that in a sentence, I guess, from both perspectives?
Okay, so a pastoral, so the pastoral is kind of like it's a bit of a weasel word in the it's a kind of lingua franca in Catholic circles. Pastoral, dialogue, accompaniment, discernment. It's a very touchy feeling. The idea here is that it's a bit about how you are. The idea of being pastoral is supposed to be being encouraging and helping the faithful, however gently, to live more perfectly in accordance with church teaching. So if you want an example of scripture, think of the way that Jesus approached the two, Martha and Mary, after the death of Lazarus and the differences in his approach, right? So with one, let me bring it up. So let me bring up the verse, right? So from John chapter 11.
I've got one locked and loaded too that I think I will follow this one with. So tell me the one that you're thinking of, and I'll tell you the one that I think works with my version of secret sensitivity, and then we'll see what matches up.
Well, here's the thing, right? Pastoral. I'm speaking of pastoral in the Christian ideal, right? So when Jesus was comforting the sisters of Lazarus, when Martha heard Jesus was coming, she goes out to meet him, but Mary stays at home. And Martha says to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now, God will give you whatever you ask." And Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha answered, "I know he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this?" And she says, "Yes, Lord, I believe you're the Messiah, the Son of God." And then she goes back, she calls her sister Mary, and Mary heard this. She goes there, and when Mary goes to Jesus, she says, "Lord, if you had been there, my brother would not have died." And unlike Martha, who's composed, Mary is at her feet and crying. And Jesus sees her weeping, and he is deeply moved, and he asks her, "Where have you laid him?" "Come and see, Lord," they said, and then Jesus wept. So you see that there is a very different approach to these two different ladies based on their state of mind and where they're at spiritually, really. Martha is more advanced. Martha is more advanced spiritually. So he gives her a lesson about the resurrection. But Mary is not in that place. She's still grieving. And so Jesus weeps with her. And that's supposed to be the ideal of being pastoral.
Okay. So
But
it's
the problem,
it's like temperament type, like adapting yourself to the temperament of the flock kind of thing, right?
yes, exactly. Now the problem is adapting yourself to the temperament and also adapting yourself to where they are spiritually, in their spiritual advancement. The problem with pastoral, as it's come to be used in certain Catholic circles, is that it's kind of become a weasel word, uh, because it's supposed to help people live more perfectly in accordance with church teaching, but some people will use pastoral to kind of downplay church teaching on subjects that might make people uncomfortable, like the Catholic view on what same-sex marriage should be.
Right. So if you want to be pastoral, you don't want to, throw the book at a woman who has had an abortion, even if you're not sure she knows that it's wrong, because you want to be comforting and you want to meet her where she's at. Would that be sort of an example of kind of a misuse of that, or like using it in a way that you feel like undermines church doctrine?
I would say that if you are pastoral, the false pastoralness, if you that this false pastoral view, if you go to a woman who has abortion and you try to downplay the gravity of the sin she's committed, and you just say, "Oh,
Gotcha.
everything's all right. God loves you," et cetera, et cetera. You don't even have to lie, but you're just downplaying orthodoxy.
Right.
You're not, and it's not something that's kind. It's complacence. It's
Right.
basically nicely leading someone off a cliff. It's basically, and
Right.
that's a huge problem within Catholic circles. If this seeker sensitivity is anything like being pastoral, then I can see why it would be a huge problem.
Yeah. Okay. So then that actually works great, and I think it, interestingly enough, sort of highlights some of the difference between evangelical Protestants and the perspective from the Catholic view, because the seeker sensitivity is more focused on individuals who may be, I mean, it's in the name, seekers, right? So they're people that aren't believers, or people that are very weak in their faith, that are looking for a body, and that you want to be sensitive to those people's temperament, kind of like you talked about, but in a way that draws them in. And I think in a way it can be done properly. And the primary proof text for this in Protestant circles, or more evangelical Protestant circles, would be 1 Corinthians 9:20, when Paul's talking and he talks about how to the Jews I became as a Jew in order to win the Jews, right? So that would be right. So that would be the seeker sensitivity perspective, that from an evangelical view, that we're trying to draw these guys in. And I think it's really a combination of the both, because you do have a lot of guys that grew up in the church that probably feel alienated, and so you could use the term pastoral to describe, okay, well, we want to really make the church such that they feel comfortable and they don't feel alienated. And also, hey, look, we all have all these young guys that are looking for meaning. They're not Christians. They're looking for traditional values and things like that. So we have to be sensitive to them as they're seeking, and create an environment in our churches that they're going to be attracted to. And I think, so go ahead.
It's like, if I had to guess, the difference where it goes wrong is you want to be you want to create a place to nurture their faith, but you don't want to be the indulgent mother, if that makes sense.
Right. And I think, like, you don't want to be a sycophant in order to win these young guys, especially if you're having to be a sycophant in regards to things that are, I believe, objectively immoral. And I think that what we've seen is a movement in some very niche reform spaces towards that sort of seeker sensitivity for radical young guys. And I think, I mean, like, in certain scenarios, different figures have directly said this. I think Stephen Wolfe tweeted something, who wrote the book on Christian nationalism, basically. He tweeted something about this recently, and I'm paraphrasing because I can't find the tweet this very moment, but it was something to the effect of, like, you're going to lose all the young guys if you don't conform to what we're saying about Christianity and the post-war consensus and things like this. And I don't even know if he referenced post-war consensus. It's just my memory.
I mean,
And so when I see that, it's sort of, I'm getting twinges of the same things I hear from progressives, and I don't like using the term woke right. I've told Neil Shenvi and some other people that have coined that term and used it pretty aggressively that I think it's not a very good term. But I do think there's something to that mentality that we've adopted when we are not, we're no longer assessing these different political viewpoints and temperaments from a biblical Christian worldview, and we're trying to figure out how to contort the Christian worldview such that it makes people who already hold those beliefs comfortable and attracted to our communities.
right. I mean, but here's the thing, right? And I think maybe we might disagree on this. I don't think that being an Orthodox Christian requires believing in a lot of the bromides and historical narratives that seem to dominate 20th century liberalism. Would you agree with that?
Yes. Yeah. So, and certain things in that I would definitely wholeheartedly agree with, surrounding things like feminism would be a huge one. I think certain aspects of different racialist, racially egalitarian thought would align with that, and that would be accurate too. The problem is that what I've tried to really do with my account is draw a line on those on various topics for where, hey, we've probably as a church overextended into trying to placate and be comfortable with these different ideas. And I think that sort of the clearest point that I've been able to identify is really Nazism, or at least a veneration for or desire to defend Hitler, because it was sort of just such a clear ideological distinction in the 20th century. And I think with the study that I've done, it's indefensible for a Christian to try to advocate for Hitler as being a righteous person. Now, if you want to make different historical claims surrounding whatever details and all that, I may think you're motivated in one way or the other. But I've seen how that mindset correlates with other sort of ills in the lives of a lot of these guys. And I think pastors are blind to that if they're extremely motivated to be attractive to young men that they feel like have been disenfranchised.
Why do you think that these young men, they feel like these young men, why do you think they feel the need to defend Adolf Hitler and his actions? I mean, that narrative came about decades ago. Most people are, it's going to be out of that. World War II is going to be out of living memory very soon. So why is there this, why do you think that there's this desire to rehabilitate Adolf Hitler?
Well, I think young people, period, and especially young men, really buck against any societal orthodoxy, little o orthodoxy. And I think when they see the society around them tell them that many other things that are deeply sinful, homosexuality, things like this, are acceptable, then they question the entire structure of whatever our society believes about morality. And that happens to include World War II, around the immorality of Nazi Germany and things like this. And I can empathize with that. The problem is that those topics need to be handled individually, and that our culture is not at such a point where it is so completely unregenerate that we have lost all ability for basic moral reasoning, right? We're not. I don't think we're at that point. I think that there's a reason why in the West, when people proclaim that Hitler is some sort of righteous person, that people recoil at that. And I don't think that that's based on some sort of intrinsically leftist or what some would call even satanic worldview surrounding the nation of states and things like this. I think it's because we still have, we're still in the West running off the fumes of a Christian worldview, and things have remained that have stayed aligned with that, and then there's other things that have gone completely out the window. And I think discernment is figuring out when that happens, and the people that are compelled to just say all of it is depraved, and they build their worldview on whatever the opposite of that is, are essentially opening themselves up to attack from the other direction wholeheartedly, completely, right? And I feel like I've seen this quite a bit, and maybe you've observed the same thing.
Yes, I have actually. There was a guy named Joel Davis who I followed for a while, who recently came out and caused quite a stir in ethno-nationalist circles when he said that in order to be a white nationalist, we have to rehabilitate Nazism and Adolf Hitler as a person. And his reasoning is that what Absolute Defender says, it's the myth of the century, the post-war consensus, as some people have put it.
Right.
And let's see, the reason they defend him is because they feel the myth of the 20th century based on a foundation of lies. That doesn't mean they're right about Hitler, but we shouldn't own the 20th century myth. The idea here is that if you accept that this movement and that man is evil, then you have swallowed, by logical extension, the view that any movement that even resembles him must also be bad, and might even be equally bad, given the chance. And so that's obviously a rhetorical problem for people who want to put this espouse a white ethno-nationalist worldview, because then they have to. What they have to do then is overcome what they would see as like an evil notion that the white race is uniquely corrupt, that any advocacy for white people in the public sphere is sinful. They believe that directly follows from claiming that Hitler was evil.
Uh-oh, you're getting alarmed. What's going on? Are you there?
Yeah. Sorry, I have to take this phone call. I'll be right back. But you could talk talk to the audience for me, please.
Oh, okay. All right. We'll talk to the chat. Let's take a look at the chat here. All right. Yada yada. Knitting circle and cliques are why I don't like Protestant churches, and all the really feminine over-focus on forgiveness and not about virtue and justice. I'm not sure I agree that forgiveness is feminine. I think maybe there's a flavor of what's called forgiveness that's feminine, but I don't think forgiveness is feminine. And sadly enough, I'm not sure virtue is masculine. Not necessarily. Unfortunately, I wish it was, because we'd have a lot more virtuous people. Can you comment on the cop-out of the post-war? Hold on. Can you comment on the cop-out the post-war consensus rhetoric is? Yeah, I mean, I've heard people use this term in ways that are useful and ways that are not useful. I will say that I think the guy who coined it, and I can't remember his name off the top of my head, would disagree with the way that the term is being used right now. I think it's Reno something, the Strong Gods. I forget his full name. I think the book is like something Strong Gods. And my understanding is that his view of this is more just an observation of what people are longing for, not necessarily the idea that every conclusion that the West has reached for the last 100 years is intrinsically satanic, right? I think that's a pretty silly perspective on it, and I think it's basically handing the left the keys to your brain to be able to decide what you think about any sort of topic, if you're going to just let them direct it by saying what they think, and then you just pick the opposite. I love your work, not our guy, but you are spicy. Okay, cool. Yeah, Ramrod, I agree. Yeah, the post-war consensus isn't really useful. I'm really big in the Anglosphere remembrance of that era in the 19th century. They were way more based than people seem to want to remember. Yeah, I mean, there's definitely an aspect of this. I mean, I've even sent Ramrod, I think I sent you through DMs something about Churchill and some different statements that Churchill made that were explicitly, talking about Christendom, or at least like the Christian West, right? And that would be sort of the tail end of that, obviously not in the 19th century, but there's definitely this idea that everything in the West was bad even before Hitler, right, and controlled by the Jews or whatever. And then Hitler came along and tried to save it, and he failed, and it's just kind of been getting worse since. And I think that's pretty silly. And I think that that we've actually seen some great gains in some regard in the West for Christianity over the last 150 years, even if as a percentage of the population, the amount of people that are professing has dropped. I don't think that's necessarily reflective all the time of exactly all the ideologies of the last 120 years. What else we got in here? I wonder what Protestant churches this guy is going to, because it's not mine or a Reformed Presbyterian one. Yeah, I will say that there are a lot of Protestant churches that are pretty infected by the seeker sensitivity idea, kind of like I was talking about earlier with Will. You can definitely land yourself in a scenario with a highly seeker-sensitive Protestant congregation, either mainline or evangelical, where you will feel, and it will be probably pretty accurate, that feminism has done a number on it. And I still would say that I don't really label doctrines like forgiveness as feminine, though. I would say that that seems to sort of undermine who Christ was in a way that's pretty fundamental. Oh, Will's okay. Oh, we got some chats further up here. Hold on. Ramrod, I don't think anything about total depravity negates the idea that genetics impact human behavior. Maybe it impacts us differently, but all sin is still equal, especially for Calvin. We need, okay, yeah. Yeah, so I think that the idea behind how genetics influences behavior is pretty complicated. And I would say most people that are very confident about that are speaking way beyond the level of confidence that we really ought to have from any sort of scientific perspective right now. I don't think that people making basic heuristic deductions about people groups is wrong. It just so happens that the people that seem very obsessed with those heuristic deductions are also very maladjusted and have a whole lot of other things off base with their worldview of mankind and their beliefs about other people groups. I do think that historically in the U.S. there have been there have been groups of people that have been able to hold to beliefs about entire people groups, some of which today would be considered very distasteful, that did not hate those entire people groups. And I see less of that today. I see a lot less of that nuance today, where it does seem like a good majority of people on Twitter that seem to be very obsessed with group differences in all these different regards and behavior also have some pretty serious disdain for those other people groups. And I think when you scratch the surface, or actually dig a little deeper, rather, past the surface, you'll find that it does go back to genetics in terms of what they think about it, and not just incident of culture and background of religion and things like this. Here's another one. Everything bad in the church is feminism, but when we're pandering to young men, that's being seeker sensitive. I feel like I'm going mad. Yeah, so I would say that seeker sensitivity to feminism is a bigger problem than seeker sensitivity to radical young men. I've been pretty consistent, I think, with what I've said online and this account specifically, that I think that leftist social worldview is a bigger threat to the church than radical right dissident weirdo people, right? So I just happen to think that I'm sort of weirdly enough, uniquely equipped to handle one side of those things. But don't hear me as saying that feminism is not a larger issue in that regard either. Hey,
hello there. All right, I'm back. Sorry about that, folks. I was a phone call from family. When you got to take the call, you got to take the call.
Yeah, I gotcha. No, we've been having a great little one-way chat here with the chat, so it's been good.
All right. Well, I've got so many wonderful people in my audience. We're small but growing community, like the mustard seed, like the mustard seed. Anyway, so I believe in my notes, I was going to ask you. Oh yeah, so there's something that I notice here, and it's something of an inconsistency I see within like these radical historical revisionists, because on the one hand, they will go out of their way to talk about how mainstream history on the World War II and the Holocaust and everything surrounding that is just all made up. It's been a massive cover up for for decades now.
Grand conspiracy type stuff.
Grand conspiracy that, and I'm not one to doubt that there are conspiracies, that history isn't written by the victors, especially in a time of war when a lot of things are distorted by the fog of war effect. Even now, modern day conflicts, you have to be very careful of what news you're getting, because even people who are directly involved in the heat of combat don't know what's happening a lot of the time. Right. But with all that being said, they have such a radical view on these things, and yet when it comes to mainstream media reporting that flatters their ideological preconceived notions, and even some that don't, they just accept it without question. They've become incredibly credulous. Like, for example, a recent example, I think I shared it with you on Twitter. It was the new Pope's speech.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's a good example.
Oh yeah, so Pope Leo. The idea is Pope Leo criticizes the exclusionary mindset of emerging political nationalisms, stating the church must open the borders between peoples and break down barriers between class and race. And so he was like, what? And there was this one right-wing guy, Keith Woods, who said, wow, this is more radical than Pope Francis. This is very liberal. This is super liberal. It's like communist even, or like, okay, I'm not saying that, but Keith Woods didn't say that, but it's kind of implied. And the problem is that the context changes the meaning of what was happening. First off, the quote about breaking down the barriers between class and race, that is something that happens within the church, right? Because it follows directly from Scripture. And you're neither Jew nor Greek, etc. And it's also taught. And in this case, he's also quoting Benedict XVI, not Pope Francis. And then on top of that, what was it? Oh gosh, I've lost the word, but the context. Yes, that's the word. The context is that he's talking about Gaza. The war happening in Gaza, the war happening between Ukraine and Russia. And he's talking about, because he's saying where there's love, there's no room for prejudice, for security zones separating us from our neighbors, for the exclusionary mindset that tragically we now see emerging also in political nationalisms. So notice here, he's not saying that political nationalisms are evil, but that this exclusionary mindset that is emerging within them is evil, and contrary to the love of Jesus, which I think anybody with anyone who knows a little bit about Christianity would be able to understand. And he's referencing Gaza and Ukraine. And he's saying that the wars plaguing our world are a tragic sign of this exclusionary mindset. Let us invoke the spirit of love and peace. May he break down open borders, break down walls, dispel hatred, and help us live as children of our one Father who is in heaven. And so on the borders between people, he's basing this on a speech made by Benedict XVI during his homily on Pentecost and the Tower of Babel. So, yeah, the speech is not nearly as crazy left wing as some of these outlets are claiming, and yet Keith Woods and others who would be normally very skeptical of what the mainstream media says just gobbled it up wholeheartedly, as if it's if I didn't know better, I would say that they might have an axe to grind with the Catholic faith, or at least the Catholic hierarchy, and yet ostensibly Keith Woods is not anti-Christian in his orientation. Now, and more to the point, this is so radically out of step with his normal attitude towards mainstream media. Like, why would we expect them to just be honest? Why would you conclude that they are all in on a massive conspiracy to cover up most of 20th century history, and yet they wouldn't be lying to you here? That's my view on these. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it would also kind of go back to Francis, because I know there were a lot of things that Francis had said that some of which were probably taken pretty extremely out of context and then sensationalized to a high degree. I don't think, and this is maybe a 1 Corinthians 2 sort of thing of like man not understanding, like natural man not understanding things as the spirit. But I don't think we can expect people that are unregenerate, non-believers, to identify when religious leaders are speaking in terms of the church and the unity of the body of Christ versus political ends. And I think that this is why it's especially heinous sometimes when that line is blurred by religious leaders themselves. And I think there have been people, even in my own camp, I can think of, that have done that. That would be sort of my direction politically, even. But at the same time, you're right about the selective skepticism on the part of the media and a part of institutions, right? I don't know what the solution to that is, because I've discovered, even just looking into World War II history as aggressively as I can for a very niche topic, right? How difficult it is to really uncover the original truth of anything that happens, even if we have lots of time between us and that to be able to cut through all of the muck. It still feels to me that we can't. It's very difficult to expect people to have the same level of skepticism for everything that they hear. But it is telling what ideology they may be possessed by, where they apply that skepticism. And I do my best to try to apply that same kind of skepticism, or the same level of skepticism, to people that would agree with me politically. But I'm not going to pretend like I'm not guilty of that also. But what you've identified is I think that if people were at least able to acknowledge that would go a long way. And what I see at least in the circles that I critique quite a bit, is a rejection of self-awareness around that sort of selective skepticism. And if you bring it up, the idea is that, oh, well, you must be defending X, Y, Z. And it's like, well, no, I do actually think that the truth on this topic matters. And even if I only care that the truth on a certain topic matters because I'm motivated from one direction, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't also care about what the truth on that is. So that may be a sort of a roundabout answer.
Oh no, it's just fine. You actually, I think before we got on, you mentioned before that you had something that you wanted to show me. Is it perhaps related to natural law theory or anything that I cover on my channel?
Oh, yeah. So it wasn't necessarily about that. I will say that I think you were right about the differences between the terms used for natural in 2 Corinthians, 14, and Romans 1. Mm-hmm. So I haven't looked into that enough to be able to like really contend with you maybe on the natural law versus presuppositionalist, divine coherent theory type of thing. But the thing that I did want to bring up, which I heard today, was I was listening to Redeem Zoomer, funnily enough, in the car on the drive home from work. Mm-hmm. And he sort of asserted, and maybe it was a little, I got the sense it was might have been a little bit of an unfair representation, that Catholics don't believe in penal substitutionary atonement. And I was a little bit...
actually, we don't. We don't believe in penal substitutionary atonement.
Okay, but I know your views are distinct from Orthodox views. So explain kind of what,
We do believe in substitutionary atonement, and in fact, we don't. We do believe in substitutionary atonement. In fact, that is the view of Saint Thomas Aquinas, Saint Anselm. In other medievals, the idea of substitutionary atonement, as far as I can tell, developed during that time. And when it comes to theories of the atonement, the only one that the Catholic Church has condemned was specifically penal substitutionary atonement, because we don't like the idea that God pours his wrath upon the Son. We think that does violence to the idea of the Trinity. We believe that the Son and the Father share the same will, and so so they have shared love for each other. And so it doesn't make sense for God to hate the Son, hate the second God the Father, to hate the second person of the Trinity. What we do think, the way we would frame it, is something more on the lines of a payment, right? So a satisfaction of so God's honor demands to be satisfied, and Christ pays that with an honorable sacrifice on our behalf. As far as I can tell, that's that, and so it's not really about God punishing us. Punishing Christ on our behalf. It's more like Christ paying a debt on our behalf in order to restore, in order to satisfy God's glory and dignity.
Okay, well then this probably Luke. Sorry to interrupt you. I thought you were done. Sorry. What were you? Finish the thought.
I think I'm done. I'll admit all I'll say is that I have not. It's been a while since I studied the different theories of the atonement, so I might be misrepresenting or not clarifying what the Catholic view of substitutionary atonement is. But as far as I can tell, that is the view, and I definitely know that penal substitutionary atonement is condemned by the Catholic Church.
Okay, gotcha. Okay, well then that clarifies a little bit around that. So interestingly enough, Zoomer Redeem Zoomer wasn't really misinterpreting you guys on that, which is good for him, I guess. So what? Yeah. This maybe ties back into some of the natural law thing. I guess my question to you on that would be like, who then holds the debt? Because from my perspective, God being the creator of the universe, and he who creates moral law by his very being and word, it's I don't know how to read scripture in such a way that anyone other than God holds that debt, right? Like, I don't see. It's hard for me to imagine how like Satan would somehow himself hold that debt. He doesn't have that authority, right? It's that God does, because that he's owed that, right? And I guess because you guys, I mean, we all sort of have our own flavor of Christus Victor. But I guess it's like, it's hard for me to understand. Can you try to clarify for me, like, who holds that debt if you believe a debt's being paid, if not God?
So the idea here is you find this within let me bring up the Summa Theologia, because
oh boy, here we go.
The Summa, yes, the Summa Theologia. This probably would have been in tertiary, in the third part, tertiary pars. Incarnation, life of Christ. Okay. Where was, okay, so substitutionary atonement 80, it's going to be 85. Question 85. A penitent. I think it's okay. So here's the deal, right? The best way to put it is, first, punishment is a morally good. It starts with the idea that punishment is a morally good response to sin. St. Thomas actually calls it a kind of medicine for sin, and because it aims to restore the friendship between the wrongdoer and the one who's wronged. All right, so that's it. Punishment is, so first, it's retribution is a medicine. It's supposed to bring about repentance and the restoration of friendship. So the second idea is that Christ bore a kind of satisfactory punishment for not for his, but for our sins. And so
and I would agree with that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, as far as I can tell, John Calvin got his idea of substitutionary atonement from the Catholic satisfaction theory, that which in turn came from evolved from earlier Christian views that go back to the time of Christ. It sounds like, so. Let's see.
So your issue would be the crushing of Christ by the Father specifically.
Oh, yeah.
It would be that specific component of it, because you would agree that, like, I mean, the debt in the Old Testament, with sacrifices like sin sacrifices, things like this, what was owed to God, right? You would agree with that.
Oh yeah, in fact, that's a huge part of our Catholic life. I mean, the sacrament of the Eucharist, in particular, right? A lot of Christians get this wrong. I mean, I know that James White gets this wrong all the time, because he's quoting a book. He's quoting like some Catholic author who is describing the Eucharist in a very overly poetic way, like describing it as bringing God down to man and so on, which is very hyperbolic. What is actually happening here is the idea of a sacrifice, because a sacrifice is not a killing. Sacrifice is not killing. Killing is part of the sacrifice, but the main part of the sacrifice is the presentation of what was sacrificed to God. And that's really what the Eucharist is in the Catholic view. It is presenting the body and blood of Christ to God and then consuming that. Christ already died, so that part of the sacrifice is already taken care of. But it can be, because this is God we're talking about, we can present the body and blood, the body and blood of the Lamb over and over and over again, as many times as possible for the forgiveness of for the forgiveness of sins and our reconciliation with Him.
Okay, yeah, and I've heard. I mean, there's a lot of Catholic versus Protestant debates surrounding like Hebrews 10.
Oh
and,
yes,
offering of the body of Christ once for all and things like this. And I won't. That's been had. So there's a lot of people that are better than both of us that have had that sort of debate. But I guess
it's
part of what I still don't totally understand is, and this is probably this may actually be a question of the Calvinistic view of sovereignty. As opposed to maybe something like Molinism or something that would be more Catholic in origin, around like I don't see a scenario where Christ died where that was not God's sovereign plan, and being within God's sovereign plan would include, right, the fact that his son died at his own hand, right, as the holder of the debt. That like Isaiah is right about, our sin crushing Christ, and that God placed him in that situation for that to occur. And so through that action, God does the wrath of God, which is just, is poured out on the Son, right?
I don't think that's I think
walk me through logically an alternative, I guess, is what I'm looking for.
Okay. How should I so the idea here, right, is God is just, and His justice is not arbitrary. That's the main thing. It's not arbitrary in that it fits within the order of the cosmos is ordered by God's justice. It's God's goodness and justice, and it is built into the structure of the cosmos, such that sin is which is a failure to render God his due honor, creates a kind of disorder in the moral order of the universe. And so this disorder is rectified through punishment or satisfaction to restore right order.
But God constructed it, and God constructed it that way, to be clear.
Oh yeah, but we would hold that whatever God constructed would reflect his justice. Whatever God would construct, because we hold God is necessarily just, God is necessarily wise. And so anything that he creates is going to reflect that, whatever it might be. Now, there are going to be counter, and there's all kinds of like hypothetical scenarios we could come up with. Like there's the idea of pure natura pura, for example, or pure nature. The idea that God, if he so wanted, could have created a world that is without sin, in which humans do not have grace. Instead, they worship God on a purely natural level. So then when they die, they do not go into heaven. They do not receive beatitude, but they just enjoy an eternal natural happiness. And that is technically possible, but but God did not create that world. But that kind of world would be just. We don't think that we're owed heaven, if that makes sense. Now, what in fact happened is that God gave Adam and Eve grace, and they rejected that, and they rejected friendship with God, and so they fell. And so we we never had pure nature. We had original justice, and then we fell, and we now have original sin. Does that make sense? So far, that makes sense, right?
Right. Okay.
Okay. So, given it now, satisfaction, as I said before, the punishment, it's not just punishment imposed, it's also interior movement of the will, where one offers something greater than the offense to restore balance. So the idea here is that in order to restore God's friendship with mankind, his honor has to be repaid. And human beings are incapable of offering sufficient satisfaction to God for sin due to our finite nature, and because of the infinite offense against God's honor that sin entails. So Christ, being fully human and fully God, is uniquely qualified to offer satisfaction on behalf of humanity. So as a man, he can offer something on behalf of the human race, and as God, his acts have infinite merit, making the satisfaction not only sufficient, but in Thomas's words, superabundant. As in, the merit of Christ is so great that it not only exceeds the infinite debt infinitely. And
So is it the debt that all of creation is owed for the restoring of that balance, but not the Father himself?
It's the debt of humanity to God for having it. It's the idea that humanity owes something to God for having sinned, and it's
so it is to God, though. It is to God himself.
It is to God, and so Christ goes to God. Christ offers himself to God. It's not necessarily a punishment, rather than a satisfaction. Now the idea,
but he does die. I mean, like, he does die,
but he does, right? So willingly. The efficacy of the atonement is that he willingly does this, and he does this as because he's obedient to the Father, even unto death. And so this loving and obedient self-giving is in itself what satisfies the demands of justice. It's not as though God hates, for that moment, hates Jesus. It's the idea that God has been dishonored, and Jesus is restoring is repaying on behalf of mankind to restore God's honor. And
so on the basis of, sorry to interrupt you, but just to try to, before I lose thought, on that basis, then, would you say that Christ offering himself up was sufficient for that that reconciliation? And if so, what is the reason for the crushing of the Son, if that is in itself sufficient?
Well, what do you mean, the crushing of the Son? You mean like his suffering?
Well, like Isaiah 53, like that our sins did crush him, right? And the idea that his death was meaningful. It wasn't just that he went to it willingly, but it was the fact that it actually happened, and that was within God's sovereign plan from the beginning of time.
Oh yeah, it is.
Before the beginning of time, right?
It is within God's sovereign plan, but
right. So what other entity could that be owed to than not the Father? I guess. Like I feel like there's like a missing piece here that we're still kind of talking past each other on. Like,
I think
if it's a debt owed, somebody's got to hold that debt. Somebody's got the note that says that and can execute it, and I don't see how that could be anyone except the Father.
Well,
right?
The difference between the Father is owed the debt, and humanity is the one who owes it. I mean, the difference between it and penal substitution is that Aquinas and Anselm do not hold that Christ is punished instead of sinners in a strict juridical sense. The idea is that Christ offers satisfaction on behalf of sinners by willingly enduring suffering in love and obedience. And God allows this to happen, not that he pours his wrath on the Son, but he allows the Son, he tells the Son to do this, and the Son obeys him willingly, and God allows this and both the Father and the Son allow this to happen, to come to pass, to bring about this greater good. It's the difference between the active and permissive will of God that I think is somewhat lacking in a lot of it is lacking in Protestant circles, and it's in a way it's not exactly your fault, because in the Old Testament the ancient Israelites did in fact lack this understanding of the active and passive wills of God. So, like for example, you'll see for, different verses saying that Pharaoh hardened his own heart, and then there's other verses that say that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. There are verses that say that God sent in Satan tempted David to make the census, and then there's the idea that God tempted David to make the census. The idea being that if God's sovereignty is such that um, he would be the cause of these things, and in a sense he is, but in the sense he is the cause of evil, but in a different sense he is not the cause of evil. He rather, what he does is he creates good things that go bad, and he allows that to happen because he with it, and it's not as though he purposefully makes it happen, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so I guess we would say, and there is a distinction in Reformed theology around decretal versus preceptive or prescriptive will of God. I would say that if the concern is splitting the wills of God, kind of like you mentioned before, that exact same splitting happens kind of in its own way for what you're positing as well.
Well, it's not really okay. It's not really a distinction in God's will. It's a distinction in how he causes evil versus how he causes good. Right? He allows evil to happen. He causes good to. He actively causes good to occur.
Right. How would you interpret, like, what does the Vulgate say? Hold on. How does the Vulgate translate like Isaiah 45:7? If you want to pull that up for me.
I actually don't have I actually don't have the Vulgate out in front of me. Isaiah
Okay, no problem.
35 verse 7, right?
Yeah. So the ESV is, I form light and
usually,
create darkness. I make well-being and create calamity. I am the Lord who does all these things. And this would be one proof text for the idea of at least a decretal will of God, which includes evil, but being separate from a preceptive or prescriptive view of God, which would be.
Oh yeah, so I mean, like I said, it's the passive versus active will. We recognize that the Old Testament does not distinguish the two, but
okay, so yeah, so but even real quick, the distinction there would be, we wouldn't consider God's decretal will to be passive. We would still consider it active. We would just consider it to be a different aspect of his sovereignty. Does that make sense? Like, because otherwise it's like the idea of God's passivity in upholding his desires for what will come to pass strikes me as almost a diminishment of him. Like that's at least my reaction from my theological perspective.
I don't think it is, because God basically is allowing this to happen by, usually usually by not doing something. He chooses not to do something, and that's what
except in the case of like Pharaoh, right?
Well, Pharaoh actually is a perfect example. God did not provide Pharaoh with the grace to act virtuously, because in a Catholic perspective, we would have said that Pharaoh resisted God's grace, so he withheld it, and God allowed Pharaoh to sin to bring about a greater good in the future, which is the freedom of the Israelites. And
okay. So that's kind of more like a Molinism. Like, you know what Molinism is?
Oh, that's not at Molinism. No, I don't believe in middle knowledge.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, what you described there kind of sounds like that, where like he knows what Pharaoh would do and he allows it to, that kind of gave me that vibe. But
I mean,
anyway.
Okay, maybe I'm misexplaining it. The difference is God does not do this based on future merits. That's the main thing, right? It's not as though God reads the future and then sees how you'll react, and then withholds or gives out grace according to that. It's all based on his sovereign plan. So in a lot of ways, it's I think Christian B. Wagner put it. We're actually closer to the Calvinists. He put it in a very polemical way, but he said we're closer to the Calvinists than we are to the Molinists, the Thomist view, in that it's God withholding grace, but it's not as though God is actively damning people, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I guess I don't want to go around in circles on it forever. I think there's definitely different levels of analysis on it, and I think I would sort of default to whatever seems to give God the most leeway in terms of sovereignty possible, even if it makes me uncomfy. But I can understand the desire to sort of reconcile the character of the persons of the Trinity with that, and that can cause tension. So I can see that. I'm trying to think of, because I think this does tie into the whole natural law idea around, like, God's perspective on things, because I don't fundamentally view God as setting up creation, watching it unfold, and then his moral law is sort of like being articulated by him in a way that's trying to conform people to the creation he's made, so much as just a sovereign decree that's ongoing from the beginning of time. And I don't think the basis of that is like restraining God from nature, right? That sort of thing kind of.
That gets back to like the Mahler debate, in fact, and
exactly right.
The way that a Thomist would view this, we view this in terms of law. So we in the Thomists define law as a rational ordinance towards by a proper authority towards the common good. And so on that assumption, there are 4 different types of law. We classify it at, eternal law, natural law, divine law, and human law. So human law is pretty easiest. It's basically positive law, and that human lawmakers make. And then but the 3 other ones are passed by God. Eternal law is basically another word for divine providence. Basically, it's the order of the universe. So when God creates something, it's not just like an inert mass. It has a certain direction, and he aims it at things. This is what St. Thomas talks about when he discusses the 5th way. Things in nature have a certain direction to them, a telos, as Aristotle put it. And St. Thomas puts it one step further and says that this is proof of God's existence, because as he put it, the arrow would not fly if there wasn't an archer aiming the arrow. The idea is that because we can perceive these purposes in creation, that shows that there is someone who created that nature that has that endowed it with those purposes, and that leads to natural law. So natural law is our voluntary participation in the eternal law. So unlike other created things, we as humans can, through our reason, figure out the purposes of existence, including the purpose of our nature. And then we can voluntarily follow that purpose. And with that free will comes moral agency and moral responsibility. And this is where we have this is where we get natural law. Natural law is basically our voluntary participation in divine providence. And
that's the distinction where I think we would begin to diverge when it comes to I would say that something akin to common grace, working in the hearts of man, even who are not believers, drawing them toward God's will, God's moral law, is what that is, and it's not derivative from rational observation of nature, right? That's kind of what we talked about this in DMs of the day. But where would you, I guess, to kind of circle it back around, just because I know the types of people that are watching this, and I want to kind of draw it into that. Where would you say, from your perspective, somebody like Mahler would go wrong then in what he perceives as using rationality to observe natural things and then drawing moral conclusions from that?
Well, I mean, to give you an idea, in the scholastic terms, he doesn't know his essences from his accidents, right? Which is a very basic misunderstanding. To give you an idea of how bad this kind of reasoning is, it'd be like saying that I don't know, because I have black hair and you have blonde hair, that means we're two different species. It's kind of like it's on that level of misunderstanding.
Do you have blonde hair? Are you blonde, Will?
No, I'm not blonde. But
okay.
I'm just giving an example. It's like
I'm just kidding. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Or it's something like, all right. So the idea in order to understand the nature of a thing, you have to understand. You have to distinguish between the essence, which is what a thing is, and the accidents, which are certain properties of a thing that do not flow from the nature or essence. Like, for example, the fact that you have blonde hair. Fact I keep using hair color for some reason, but let's
it's okay.
Let's
you
apply
can.
let's apply it to race, right? Race and intelligence. If a certain accident were to be part of the essence of a thing, then we would expect that every instance of that would have be the same. Like, for example, this is why we would deny that humanity has goodness as part of the essence, because if being a good person is part of the essence of humanity, then every person would be equally good. And that's not really, and you can see that that's not really the case. And therefore, goodness is not part of the moral goodness is not moral righteousness is not part of our essence. It's an accident to our essence. Now, we could say that humanity is very good in the sense that, our essence, our nature as being made in the image of God is very good, and so we all have that equally. Yeah, but that's very different from saying that moral virtue is found equally among all humanity. Am I making sense so far?
I guess so. How would you apply that then to the Mahlerite perspective? Yeah, okay. Try to give me a tangible, because I know kind of from my perspective, my critiques of him, and I've been pretty verbose about that on Twitter and other places on that. Okay. But most of that comes from my rejection of the view that man is capable of rationally ascertaining those moral truths from nature in the way that you seem to think that can be ascertained. Okay, right? So how would you tell somebody who says, "Hey, I'm observing these things. These are my conclusions about human behavior," and because Mahler would say he's applying a natural law. That's how he would assert that, right? And he has.
We would say that there's nothing salvific about natural law. That is the main thing about natural law. Does follow it. In the first place, we don't believe, we as Thomists, we don't believe that humanity can fully follow the natural law without divine grace. And there are two reasons for that. The first is that due to the wound, the wound of original sin, it's due to the two of the wounds of original sin, concupiscence and ignorance. So because of concupiscence, even if we do know the natural law, we would have a very hard time following it consistently. And this is actually stated by St. Paul when he says that I follow the law of my flesh, not what as I wish. That is concupiscence. It's basically a wound on human nature caused by original sin that causes us to essentially our passions are kind of out of sync with our rationality, and that leads us to sin. And then the other thing is ignorance, right? So because we are ignorant of the natural law, oftentimes the full extent of the natural law, we often don't get it 100% right. If you think about it from this perspective, if we were to lose all scientific knowledge tomorrow, and we had to start from scratch, it would take quite a bit of time for us to reclaim it all through empirical study. And even then, it would be mixed in with some errors. That's really what happened with after the fall. The idea is that humanity had to our understanding of morality, while unregenerate man can sort of parse it together. It is a long process that they're not going to do it without making mistakes here and there. And then on top of that, we also have the understanding that sinners will suppress knowledge that goes against their vices, right? So this is why St. Paul says they are without excuse, because although they can come to the right conclusions about morality, they choose not to because they're suppressing it. So it's not an ontological. It is not ontological in nature. It's moral in nature. They're choosing not to do it. They know it and they choose not to do it. That's oftentimes what happens. And this is this is one of many reasons why we need divine grace. But even then, divine grace is also necessary for salvation, which is we believe is above the natural order of things. The supernatural is above the natural and builds on top of it. So
would you say then that like in 1 Corinthians 2:14, that the verse we had talked about the natural person does not accept the things of the Spirit of God, for they are folly to him, and he is not able to understand them because they are spiritually discerned. You would say that those things of God are not the moral law, that's a different thing that Paul's talking about there as opposed to Romans 1.
The things of nature. Okay, so there's that verse from Romans where the things of nature. The Greek actually uses two different words. When Paul is talking about the natural man does not know the things of God, he's talking about the animal. He's using the word for natural that has the connotation of animalistic. The sensual man, the man who is given into his animal into his animal passions. It relates to that side of the soul. Whereas when St. Paul says in Romans that the things of nature tell of God's glory, he's using nature in the way that natural law would, theorists like myself would use it, like an intrinsic principle that is part of that defines the identity of the thing. And I think I told you about the two different Greek words. They're very similar looking, but and they can both be translated as nature, but that's not the kind of nature that we follow as part of natural law. We follow I think the best way to put it is we want to follow nature as God created it, not at nature as it was wounded by original sin. And
Okay, so then just to try to zoom out a little bit to some of the more topical stuff.
Mahler,
How would you say then that Babel and that sort of thing around, fall and post-fall would then be where you would start to have issues with Mahler's worldview on that, not so much just the precepts of.
Okay, so Mahler's worldview, right, has a couple of if we're considering his claim that's more difficult to sanctify Africans due to their proclivity to violence and low intelligence. It makes a lot of different errors, right? So the first error is theological in nature. It presumes that God's grace is constrained by nature. And remember, God's grace is supernatural.
And we agree on that. Two thumbs up on that one.
God, we believe that God is the author of nature, and so he's not bound by any natural law. In fact, Thomas go as far as to deny that God is a moral agent, because the idea that God is a moral agent would mean that he has duties, and God does not have duties. God just is good. He doesn't need to do anything to be good.
Okay, so when you said earlier, just in passing, that you wouldn't apply what we had talked about a second ago to salvific things, you would include you would include sanctification under that umbrella.
Sanctification is a supernatural process. It cannot be constrained by something like natural defects.
And you can understand the disconnect I have with that as a Protestant with the language you're using, because of our view of regeneration as being the moment of sealed salvation, right? Versus how you guys view sanctification in that process, right?
Well, I mean, we believe that justification is a moment, just like you guys. Sanctification is a process.
But you would still put that under, when you say salvation, you would put that under that. And I guess in the Reformed tradition, we would too, just in a different way.
Well, every Catholic says, I am saved, I was saved, I am saved, and I am being saved, is how we would put it. And so the idea that God
we would say the same thing, but we'd say that the I was saved would be from the beginning of the universe.
So the idea is to say that God is not more capable of sanctifying those with higher IQs sorry, I misspoke. God is not, quote unquote, more capable of sanctifying those with higher IQs or gentler personalities. Sanctification is God's work, so it's not man's achievement by nature, and to imply otherwise is a kind of Pelagian heresy. We don't believe that nature contributes something necessary to the reception of grace. God creates that the way I would put it is, imagine you have a computer and it was designed to run certain things, right? But it has this openness to receiving, to being upgraded and receiving something beyond its original design. And so that if God comes in with the programmer comes in with a new program that's beyond what it can normally do, he can plug it in, and it has this natural, receptiveness to it that the computer can then go do things that normally it would be impossible for it to do. It's not a perfect analogy, mind you, but the point is that it's not as though there's something in the nature of a thing that would prevent God from working his work. That's the theological error. Now, the philosophical error is treating a difficulty in nature as a difficulty for God. That's a huge difference, right? Even if we grant that a person is disposed towards, by his natural temperament, to certain vices, this makes the path of virtue more difficult for that person, not for God.
Oh, so okay. So I would say, okay, see, And that is a distinction we have. The first sphere, theologically, on our disagreement with Corey, I think we would align pretty closely. On that second one, I would say I would sort of discount the question of the difficulty of the individual, because I view regeneration as being such a miracle outside of ourselves, and God reaching down and taking our total depraved state and plucking us out, that I would
Well,
sort of I would discount anything that would be described as like a difficulty in the face of
well, it's a difficulty
of
for,
God.
but
And
it's not a
I know it's
difficulty.
for that person, but I would say that
It's a
even that is sort of
difficulty.
like, if I was comparing the difficulty of a person versus like the capability of God, it would just sort of like not even be a factor. You know what I mean? Like it's not even in the mix. You know what I'm
Well,
saying?
it's like, well, I can see that, but the thing is, we would reject that divine omnipotence is limited by human weakness. So it's not more difficult for God to sanctify a person. If anything,
Right. Because
if anything,
you would still agree with the complete capability of God, right? You would still assert that, and so that would mean that even if you would consider it a factor on the side of man, it would be negligible. Whereas I would just dismiss it as a
oh yeah,
factor. Okay, yeah, and so
oh
then I
yeah,
think
it
in
would
that
be,
regard, I think we align, and I think that does
oh yeah,
clarify a little bit on that. There are
and
certain things
then
that I've heard Mahler say about natural law and different presumptions that can be made from that I think you may have a harder time with. But for the precept of that debate, for that premise rather,
it's
I think we
sanctification
align pretty
is,
closely.
well, it's because sanctification is not part of natural law. It's like it's a part of the supernatural
Yeah.
order of things, not the natural
Okay.
order of things. So, and then there's the moral error, right? So the moral error that Mahler makes is confusing observable social problems with essential moral incapacity, which is now this goes to that accident versus substance, accident versus essence distinction.
Yeah,
So the
and the
idea
dark
here,
Calvinism meme. Yeah.
yeah. So the idea here is that human beings, because we share the same nature, we all have the same moral capacities. And because of that, different the differences in virtue and vice among people are going to be due to accidents, which are education, governance, cultural inheritance, sin, and grace. Grace is an accident because it's not part of our nature. And then also different, and yes, differences in like biology are also going to be there, but we all share the same nature. And because we have the same nature, essentially God has the same thing, is working with God is working with the same thing, humanity. And so when Mahler makes these claims about Africans, right, what he's doing is he's taking an accident and using it as the essence of the black race, as though they are which is a total category error, because that it basically treats black people as not being human, not being the same species as other races, which is
which aligns with other things that he's asserted. I mean, to be fair,
oh
so at
yeah,
least
it's
he's
racial
consistent in that. Yeah.
racial essentialism is a huge problem within the radical right, because and a lot of these people, they just don't have I've even seen people who claim that men and women have different essences, and I'm like, really? Can you show that they're are you claiming that they're not human? And they can't answer that because they don't have they don't keep in mind these distinctions between essence and accident, and so they just are all over the place because of that. And then finally, it's the kind of ecclesial consequences. It's this kind of racial predestinarianism. It's like the idea that some races are less chosen, less redeemable, less capable of attaining holiness. And the Catholic Church just flat out rejects that view. We believe that grace is universal because God loves everyone.
And the error exhibited, that error exhibited in the debate pretty clearly to me would be, and again, we use different language because of the distinction between our theological backgrounds, but where Corey sort of highlighted, I think, where he makes that error drastically is when he talks about how, Christianity is a proposition, a hypothetical proposition.
Oh God,
and certain people, right? And certain people with less IQ are able to understand hypothetical propositions, right? Because he saw that green text or whatever, and so he's ran with it, right?
That is such a
but that would be a highlight of like exactly how he would screw that up really hard.
It's such a horrible, like, faith is a moral. Faith is a moral virtue, right? Faith is receptiveness to receiving God's receiving divine revelation. It's a disposition, a moral disposition that that a Christian believer has as a result of divine grace. And so when you say that the faith is intellectual, what he's doing there is intellectualizing as though the faith, as though, like, for example, saying that if you are incapable of understanding this proposition, then that means you're not saved, or that it's harder for you to be saved. That is not at all what we should be looking at. It doesn't matter if a mentally slow person is incapable of fully understanding and articulating the Christian faith. What matters is his disposition to receiving it.
And this is a thing, like gospel simplicity would be a thing that would come into this in the Reformed theological tradition, and the idea that this is like there really isn't a minimal level of capacity for a person to be able to discern it, and then that would make sense if you separate the rationality required for understanding natural law to draw moral conclusions from salvific things, then that would mean that you've excluded that from that pitfall that I had seen people make, right? Because you can understand, I see people make that pitfall constantly, appealing to natural law, right? Well, and so that is something that there is a distinction there.
Well, yeah, natural law is about natural virtues. So we would have said the natural virtues, the four main ones are prudence, temperance, fortitude, and justice. And then on top of that, there are the three supernatural virtues, the theological virtues: faith, hope, and charity. And God is able of infusing within us all seven of these virtues through his grace. And so a person who is now, if we're talking about like someone who has natural law, who's so stupid that he doesn't understand natural law theory and doesn't like, what I would say is not everybody is an ethicist, like an ethics professor. No, not everybody needs to be an ethics professor to understand right from wrong. You can have, this is why you have authorities in your life. You have parents, you have government. God has all of these natural authorities set up for people, for even the non-believers, to help them. And then on top of that, he also has this wonderful thing, the gospel, the church, that he gives to us, that are even better at doing that. Because St. Thomas says, this is why, for example, St. Thomas says that, points out, why do the 10 Commandments? Why is there the 10 Commandments? Why give us that? And the answer is because the Israelites were in a state where they had lived under slavery for so long that they didn't have a clear grasp of like how to be moral agents, essentially, right? They were under this oppression, and and so now that they're free, they have all this newfound moral responsibility, and so they needed help from God to just understand the basic things like thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not kill, and so on. Does that make sense?
I mean, yeah, it makes sense. I'm not sure what I think about it, but it makes sense from what you're saying.
I think the way I would put it for like a Calvinist audience is something like this. Because of mankind's original sin, it is extremely difficult for the unregenerate to understand and what is natural, what is good for us, even though the answer is right in front of us. It's very difficult for us. It's not impossible, but it's very difficult. And God, through his divine wisdom, he makes it way easier. Rather than just having to go through the effort of trial and error of figuring out what is right and what is wrong, he gives us the answer.
Gotcha.
That's how I would put it, and that's one of the. And then there's also the small fact that even if we perfectly followed the natural law, we would not be saved. We need God's grace to do that.
Okay,
that's a
gotcha.
Thing too.
Yeah, well, what you said, my biggest takeaway from this is going to be, from the Catholic natural law perspective, the distinction in salvific things versus the perception of the moral law from nature, and that it doesn't seem to be something that characterizes Mahler's philosophy or whatever he's got going on over there.
He follows like a biological reprobation in theory. It naturalizes grace. It brings God,
and we agree that that's God, like super perverse.
It takes God and brings him into the natural world, which is something that you have to resist when you are doing natural theology, because God is above nature. We know God. We know epistemologically. We know we can learn about God through study of nature, but that's because God is nature's author. He's not part of nature. He's something that he is the creator of nature, and so nature. It's kind of like learning about Shakespeare by reading his works, right? You learn a bit about the personality of the author by reading what he writes, but the author isn't the book. The author isn't in the book, unless of course he writes himself. But even then, the author is also above the book, beyond the book too. That's how.
And our distinction would also come into like his divine nature and attributes perceived through creation, like it says in Romans 1, like what that contains, where I think you would be a lot more comfortable with a broader interpretation surrounding moral laws, where I would not so much be, but that even still in both of our minds is something wholly different from things that you would call salvific, and that I would refer to as regeneration or
we would
sanctification.
We would call that like the preambula fide, or things that could help a non-believer prepare them for understanding the faith. So think about it this way: I have a channel that is dedicated to virtue ethics. If I can convince people to live a morally upright life, I think that living a morally upright life is, as I see it, is beneficial, and it's the morally right thing to do. It's on an objective level. Providing that moral clarity about different issues attracts people to the faith, because then they see that once you understand on the natural level some of these things, you start to see that maybe this Christianity thing, it's it's easier. You're removing obstacles. You're removing intellectual obstacles to people accepting the faith. It's kind of like how you would use proofs for God with a non-believer, or you might appeal to historical evidence for the resurrection with a non-believer. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does, and that gets into a whole like I gotta hop off here in like 2 minutes, but that gets
Oh yeah.
into a lot. That gets into a lot of stuff surrounding presuppositional versus classical apologetics, and that's a whole thing,
Oh yeah,
argument.
yeah.
Now my alarm is
So,
going off. Here we go.
oh my
Yeah.
gosh, I did not mean for this to go for 2 hours.
No,
That
no,
was
you're good. I said 2 hours was max, so we're right up on it. So don't worry about it.
I thought this would be ended. Okay, so what's next for your little project? Well, where can people follow your work and engage further?
Yeah, so at not our guy on Twitter or X, underscores between each word. That's where I'm at. Like most of the time, I do keep my DMs open, so I'm willing to talk to anybody who wants to talk. My YouTube channel is also Not Our Guy. I think if you just search Not Our Guy, it should be the first channel that comes up on YouTube. I'm currently working. I'm sort of dragging my feet on it, but I've been working on a video which is a refutation of Stone Choir, which is Corey Mahler's platform or whatever he's made about his claims about the Holocaust not occurring in a specific podcast. So I'm doing, it may be over an hour long, a refutation of a lot of the claims that I've made in that video. So you guys can stay tuned for that. Hopefully over the next couple months, that'll be coming out. I'm hoping that's going to answer a lot of the sort of meme tier claims that you've seen all over the internet about like wooden doors and crap that it ultimately really doesn't go a lot deeper than memes. And I haven't seen people really get into a environment where they're able to handle those objections with the depth that I think they need. So I'm hoping to do that with this video. So y'all can stay tuned to my YouTube for that, and then follow me on X. I've also got a Substack, which you can find linked in my bio on X, and I post there occasionally. That's also where I've transferred my mega thread or super thread about all of the evidence that I see validates the premise of my account, which is the fact that Hitler hated Christ. So any of those areas would be cool to start with. You guys find yourselves interested in this topic. I know this podcast went a little bit more niche, but I think we made some headway in some different ways for sure.
Okay, well, I'm glad to have talked to you today, and let's wrap up here. Good night, everyone, and I hope you have a wonderful day.